meetings, we would do our introductions and then open it up with the scenarios that we were going through, and then had questions and answers following each one of the meetings. You want to go back one? The stakeholder meeting organizations that we met with was a variety of groups and individuals within the Lexington area. The University of Kentucky, we had public and private schools, Visit Lexington, the Fayette County Development Corporation, Housing Authority, nonprofits, housing providers, appraisers. From the agricultural side, we had the Thoroughbred Association, the U.S. Stockyards, Keeneland, UK College of Agriculture, and UK CEDIC. Next slide. The meeting format roughly was about an average of 90 minutes, where we would do our introductions and go into the overview of the scenarios. And then after the scenarios are presented, we looked at some of the criteria and the metrics that would be used to measure the issues based on the sustainability and the urban growth boundaries. And then questions, comments, and discussion would follow after that. Our overall goal was to educate the public on the themes and policies of Imagine Lexington. This came out of Fayetteville Alliance and their meeting that we had with them. Their Grow Smart plan was a visualization of the themes and policies that promoted infill development, the need for missing middle income housing. And they also wanted to know, would the task force have an opportunity to inform the conversation with high level data analysis? So that was something we got into more detail as we progressed with the project. Next one. The development community, this was an active and robust group that we had met with. And what came out of that group was some interesting topics about the vacant land inventory needs, needs to be transparent, recognize constraints and stability. And some of the other items that came out of that was the need for large tracts of land for development. And there is a need, they felt, for anywhere from 200 to 500 acres of land was a suitable amount of land if you're really going to do any significant density for development. Lack of available inventory resulted in lost opportunities. They felt, like I said, the large sustainable mixed use projects weren't available. You can go to the next one, Mark, and we can talk about some more of the development and realtors. The realtors was another group that we met as part of the development side of this, and they felt that the housing inventory backlog is very tight and it's getting even tighter. And new home starts are on a downward trend. And they also felt that because of the land costs that we're going to start to see development shifting out to some of the surrounding counties, especially the adjoining counties outside of Fayette County. The Lexington prefers a single family housing market. And we have detailed information on each one of these groups that we met with, and we'll make this part of the report. These are some of the key highlights that we pulled out of each one of these groups. And the ADU ordinance is an example of a precedent that, if not passed, could be an issue of great concern as we look at focusing on urban infill and urban development. The Commerce Lexington group, I think they probably had about 20 individuals on that group. They once again stress the inventory of industrial land available in the market is lacking in the need for additional land. And I think once again, that acreage that they had expressed was within the 200 acre or land that they would need. And the fact that the dairy farm won't be ready for several years as we go through the process of bringing that online, and the need for those parcels over 5 acres. They stressed their success in developing the Bluegrass Business Park for job creation. That's been quite successful for them. And talked about workforce retention and the need to keep workforce and retain it here in Lexington is going to be based on their ability to market adequate industrial land within the community. And they also wanted to talk about how do you connect this plan in economic development with the study that is currently ongoing. Infill development, this group, we focus a lot on just what is considered infill, what's vacant, what's underutilized, and how do we identify that. And I think I'm going to go into more detail on the vacant and underutilized properties and how this is going to really affect and influence infill development as we try and incent developers. And I know this came out of some of the other groups, but especially on the affordable housing providers, the need for incentives, and we've heard it on the developers as well, the need for incentives are going to be important. We're going to encourage and incent developers to build housing within a defined area. Next one, Mark. This is the affordable housing group that we met with, and these were affordable housing nonprofit providers and groups that are involved in this. Groups such as Housing Authority, No Lie Development Corporation, the Urban League, and their Community Development Corporation as well. Once again, the need to attract and increase infill and affordable housing, the need for developers. We also heard from them that the Affordable Housing Trust Fund is just not adequate to provide the necessary incentives or funding to meet needs that are even growing in terms of affordable housing within the community. And they summed it up with the community is going to want and must embrace goals for affordable housing and diversity if we're really going to be this community that's going to be able to sustain housing for all mixed types, uses, and affordability ranges. The neighborhood associations, this was driven primarily through the Lexington Urban Neighborhood Association group. Their concerns were they want to make sure we preserve the rural areas and support urban growth within your urban service boundary, and preserve and protect the neighborhoods and the quality of life that's there. Their issues are also concerned on their level and role of involvement in zoning text amendments, and they continue to be engaged in that process, and they want to have a role. They stress that most of the most vulnerable neighborhoods, and this gets to some of the issues of that you're seeing in the Lexington gentrification task force group that's working, that the most vulnerable neighborhoods are also the most impacted, and we're going to have to increase investment and protections to protect those neighborhoods so that they remain affordable, but yet they don't get the increasing pressures of development that you're seeing in some of the areas that are currently being gentrified. We also met with urban county government and the schools, public and private schools. Traffic was one of the key metrics that came out of this group, these groups. Water management, the issues as far as it relates to EPA and the consent decree. And one thing that was glaring that came out of this process was that regardless of the demand for growth, the city has no plans to increase or build a new treatment plant. And that's going to be one of the key drivers to any future growth or development. They're doing what they can to keep up with the current demand with the consent decree and the upgrade and improvement of their sewer treatment capacity and stormwater management. But there are no plans at this point for any additional or new treatment plants, regardless of how growth and development may or want to occur. The land for new schools from Fayette County Public Schools is always an issue in terms of their provisions, and we're seeing that as well. And they made reference to guidance for future plans like the Parks Master Plan, a neighborhood in transition, some of the recommendations that's coming out of that, and Public Schools Development Plan. Then agriculture, we had 2 meetings with the agricultural groups. That came about, we're talking about the role that agriculture plays in agricultural technology are 2 key things that will be a driver in terms of development, also how you're going to protect what's there. There's always a threat of encroachment into the agricultural lands. It's not unusual that development and agriculture don't mix very well. So how do we preserve and protect what we've got, but yet balance that out with development within the boundary. There's discussion about we do have some rural hamlets and rural communities. We want to try and preserve and protect those because that is an asset, and there is some limited development that's being permitted within those hamlets and rural communities. Make reference to the ag tech industry. That's a priority as an economic development opportunity that can be enhanced and improved upon. And then some questions and discussion came up on UK South Farm. What role and how is UK going to continue to use that? And at this point, there's no plans to move forward of any proposal or anything else other than teaching and outreach. And if they do have to relocate, it's more than likely that it probably will not be in Fayette County. Next one. That's a quick summary of what we've done with the different types of organizations and entities that we've met. They were robust meetings. Some of the ones we didn't highlight here, but we did have a discussion with a developer in Louisville, Bill Whalen, just on what he thought in terms of benchmark community. He's done similar type developments in other communities, Dayton and Louisville and some other areas. So we had a good discussion with him in terms of benchmarking what he feels works and how it works. And a lot of that was based on being driven by public-private investments and the role that government should play as we incent and encourage developers to develop within a defined growth boundary. And we're also looking at what types of incentives, and that would be based on zoning regulatory enhancements and how do you improve the process for development in terms of the amount of time that it takes to get something through is also costly for development. So we had a variety of discussions on that as well. Given that, I think we'll be glad to answer any questions. Mark and John and Cynthia said in on a couple of the meetings as well. So if you have any questions, otherwise I'll turn it over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Ed. Bryce, it looks like you have your hand up.
Thank you. I was curious, Ed, I know it's my understanding that the Euphrates group is doing our new business recruitment into our market. And I was curious if you'd met with them as well and their opinion of how they're positioning the city relative to and what kind of reaction they're having in recruiting business. Yeah,
we did meet with Euphrates. They were on one of our group meetings as well. And they've been active in recruiting. And I think a week ago, we had a discussion with him. There's so many different groups, but he was on another group, but he was talking about the need to continue to market Lexington and Fayette County. His discussions are the availability of land and how they can actually market it. But he seems to indicate, and I know Craig and Kevin are working with him on another economic development initiative, but from all indications, it appears to be he's got some interest in terms of the workforce and continuing marketing in Fayette County. But we did meet with him.
And I would add that, the one thing that my takeaway from his remarks were, he recognizes the basic crux of the matter, that we need to have the available land, the space to expand our economy, but we also want to protect what makes Lexington unique and an attractive place. So it's, protect while build would be like kind of the modus operandi that he was promoting. And I think that's a fairly commonly agreed upon consensus there.
That's great. I just didn't see him listed in any of the presentation. I want to make sure that he was included.
Yeah, I think on the second slide, we identified him as one of the groups, if I'm correct. It was on slide number 3. Euphrates was in there. I remember seeing him somewhere. Yeah, and on slide 4, number 5 was Euphrates.
Thank you. What other questions are there? Lynn?
Thanks. Ed, I know that you're not an agent of the Fayette County Public Schools, but Fayette County Public Schools has been so not compliant with the urban services boundary because they don't have to be. And the Brenda Cowan School is an example, the Dunbar School. And I know there's an awful lot of new development happening in that expansion area off Hayes Boulevard.
Right.
Polo Club. Any talk about another middle, another elementary? Do we need to think in that area about school, maybe scooting beyond the boundary?
Yeah, I think along the Baptist Health Campus, that area there, I think there's talk about either in another middle school or maybe an elementary school, elementary.
I think the land has been purchased, or the land has been set aside for the schools, for new schools there on Polo Club. We have it in our development, or the materials we've gotten for other development plans. And we actually are including, as a part of our scenarios, space for additional schools as well, and some of these larger tracts that we are doing the build out analysis for. In regard to our conversation with their development officer, I mean, she is obviously more directed, and I think they are in the process of updating their development plan. But she's more consumed with the short-term focuses of what they need for their facilities as they exist in their current locations. And again, the main takeaway was it's always because of the requirements, state requirements for what the school properties have to include and have to have. It's always difficult to find suitable properties, and obviously the urban service boundary doesn't make it easier. But that they have, that she would just direct us to, for our purposes of understanding how to incorporate school space or space for schools, to look at their development plan. And so that was primarily what we talked about in our conversation.
Right, and I think one of the takeaways she was indicated that finding available land that meets the requirements that are established by the Kentucky Department of Education in the district facility plan drives a lot of those decisions.
Well, if we could just encourage them to stay inside the boundary, that'd be a good start.
Absolutely.
Yeah, they're not very good neighbors that way.
I agree with you, Lynn.
Yeah.
Randall?
Randall?
Yes, so Mark, in that same vein regarding Fayette County Public Schools, I believe in their local facilities plan, they're looking to combine the east side and south side vocational schools, and they purchased the Hurl Leader Building, and they're combining those programs into the Hurl Leader Building. Did they talk at all about what happens to the land once they vacate those two properties?
No, they did not bring that up. So thank you for bringing that to my attention.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great point, Randall. Great point.
Are there any other questions before we move on to growth scenario discussions? Vice Mayor?
Yeah, thanks, Greg. Ed, just a couple of questions about actual participants in your meetings, the neighborhoods. That slide, what groups were represented or what individuals?
It was the Urban Neighborhood Association, and within that were different neighborhoods. Walt Gaffney, I think, is in charge of that. And
So,
there were.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but are you talking about the Fayette County Neighborhood Council?
No, this was the Lexington Urban Neighborhood Association. There's an association of urban neighborhoods. And I don't know,
Okay.
are you familiar with them?
Well, Walt Gatfield is the president of the Fayette County Neighborhood Association, which is a different organization and older, and the other, but I didn't know if you had included them as well.
If I can comment on that, I apologize for interrupting, but I did want to let you know I attended one of the meetings where Walt Gatfield attended as part of the neighborhood council, and there were probably 5 or 6 other representatives from that same organization. that he had, I believe he had invited as well. So they were represented as part of the meeting.
We also reached out to some of the neighborhood associations that we felt were more urban oriented. In addition to the association, then we went to individual neighborhood associations like William Wells Brown and I think the one off of North Broadway there.
Okay, and the reason for focusing on the more downtown neighborhoods is you think they're more likely to see more intense development as opposed to the neighborhoods that are out, you know?
We're representatives from various neighborhood associations, and I think they generally ran the gamut because we had some folks that were even outside the urban service boundary.
Right.
I think Larry Hanna was representing.
Lyle Hanna.
Lyle Hanna. Yeah. So I feel like we had a relatively diverse, comprehensive group geographically. And I felt that they were representing their individual neighborhood associations and each had their own, specific issues that were of concern to them. Like, for example, by the university, student housing, like the effect of student housing, but other places it was the effect of like the new zoning text amendment changes that were allowing different types of development on corridors affecting residential neighborhoods. So it was, I think Craig, you may have the best, if you have the Zoom record of that. We wrote down as many of the names of the people that were speaking as possible, but we had about 10 representatives on that call in neighborhoods, and it was a long and a pretty impassioned discussion.
Yeah, but my concern, Vice Mayor, was that some of the urban neighborhoods that are going to be impacted by development are the ones I wanted to get some feedback on in terms of what they see are some of the critical issues of that will be impacting them as encroachment continues to grow upon them within their neighborhoods.
I guess that you're mentioning that leads me to it's not a question, it's really a comment that has to do with the use of the word affordable for affordable housing. And some people on this call are tired of hearing me talk about this, but I think it's important to distinguish between the general use of that term, housing affordability or affordable housing, which refers to how affordable generally housing is in Lexington, which by most comparisons we're still fairly affordable, as opposed to the HUD definition of affordable housing, which is used to talk about what projects can actually be incented. So what percent of the area median income people who are renting, what level they are, what actually constitutes affordable housing by the HUD definition. And they're different. And I think they often get mixed and confused. So I'm just kind of trying to make a point about careful use of that going forward. So thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Vice Mayor. Any other questions before we move on? I don't see any hands raised. So Mark, if we could move on to the growth scenarios discussion portion.
Sure. Okay, I'm going to share my screen again. And so last month we I think it's maybe February, we presented the vacant land use analysis, and then last month, and that basically or vacant land inventory. And then last month we did a preliminary, we kind of did the build out scenario based on our scenario 1, which I don't know why I use hand quotes, but our scenario 1, which is basically our by the book, what was on the map today, what we could expect as far as if we had total build out, what we could get in each of these main baskets of the development: residential, retail, office, industrial. So now we have gone through the process of trying to fill out the 2 other scenarios that we want to use in our evaluation process. And again, these are theoretical, conceptual scenarios that represent various mileposts along the spectrum of what could possibly be, occur in the next 20 years as a part of, under the authority of what's available under the Imagine Lexington plan. So the purpose is to get your confirmation of these scenarios, discuss them, and also so we can move forward with our actual the development of the of evaluation and bring back to how we get to an evaluation framework with these scenarios in it. And we do have a few options at the end that we'd like to get your decision on. So that's the goal. In general, we have been taking in the comments from these stakeholder meetings, taking in the comments from task force and the advisory committee in general, but again, these are still conceptual. We are trying not to imply a specific development plan that is one thing or another, but more of if we use these basic ideas of increased density, or in some cases, changing the zoning classification to allow something else to happen. How can we do the build out, meet certain targets, and therefore find a way to do the evaluation. So just to start, this is a map of the vacant land, including agricultural land inside the urban service boundary. This is by zoning class. So this is generally where we would expect to see when we're doing our build out analysis. This is what we're filling in. And as you can see, there's infill development opportunities on vacant land, and there's also opportunities for underutilized or redevelopment of underutilized properties. Again, we have talked with the planning staff and gotten their concurrence on the general availability of a vacant land. If you combine the land in agriculture as available for development with residential and even in commercial, we get a total of about 5,100 of vacant acres inside the urban service boundary, and they concur with that number. This table represents the scenario one filling out of the math, adding up Cynthia using the Lexington's development code, making the explicit assumptions assumed under each of these zoning classifications, fills out the amount of potential residential dwelling units and or commercial square feet in various categories. Understanding that for like industrial, it's pretty clear that it is industrial type land or a development, and in some of these other business categories, it could be a mix of retail or office space in other kinds of commercial development. So this is a summary table for scenario one, and we've developed similar math for scenarios 2 and 3, but I use this one as an example to show you how explicitly we go through each of the categories to come up with our final number, which in this case, you can see in scenario one, as is on the books, we estimate the ability to build out over 27,000 dwelling units and up to 16.7 million square feet of commercial space. And that includes, in the industrial categories, the potential for up to 3.4 million square feet. Just so you get back again, a reference to what our targets are, where we're going with this. We've used the basic trend lines from the past 20 years to give us an upper and lower bounds of what's possible. Just knowing that it's going to be somewhere, we have a high probability of being somewhere in between. So on the low side, the last 10 years trend line based on the American Community Surveys growth of our population and households. If we carry that trend line out, we will need by 2040 29,000 housing units. Comparatively, if we use what the state data center is projecting, and that is based more on that's a more long-term trend line that they're using. again, this also, I should point out, does not consider the urban service boundary as like a limiting factor. They're doing more of a traditional demographic calculation estimation. So this is the more full growth scenario. They have the population of Lexington increasing to 420,000 by 2040, which would project to about 41,000 housing units. So if on an annual basis, you can see what Lexington needs to add to the market on an average basis would be somewhere between 1,400 and 2,000 houses a year. Similarly for retail, again, these are trend lines from the recent state of the inventory and added inventory to the Lexington Fayette County market. On the last 10 years, it's been on the conservative side. The 20 years includes a period of significant growth between 2000 and 2008. So this is how we get our bound here. And you can see it's pretty significant, pretty wide by the time you get out to 2040, 2.2 million versus 5 million. And again, we expect it to be in between, but probably, I think from our conversations, both with the task force and with others, there's a little bit more expectation that it's going to be on the lower side, given just the changes in the economic climate and the way of retail is occurring. Same thing with office. You can see that, again, the longer trend line grows higher than the more recent trend line. And again, we would expect it to be probably closer to the conservative side, just simply on the basis of the current events and how office space is being reconsidered and how much is available. Industrial. This is obviously a very critical category because it has the least amount of land available, and one could make the case that the lack of industrial development in the last 10 years is directly related to the availability of space. So the lower trend line represents what has been brought on in the last 10 years. But again, in theory, if more of available space was possible, you could see something higher than that at the 20-year level, when again, like the other commercial sectors, there was a much larger development of that stock, that it could be as high as 5.6 million square feet. So again, somewhere in between is most likely what we would expect to see organically. So I'm going to start with industrial, just because I think it is probably the most tenuous, or in terms of what we have land supply for. And these are just the basic assumptions for how we assumed what would be needed, or what we could be developed on the available land. And basically, Cynthia looked at how the historic ratio of square footage to acreage occurred and how it has occurred most recently. And as you can see, from a citywide perspective, the ratio, it was 0.18 acre, or 0.18 square of a particular lot would be equivalent in square feet. But since 2000, that's gone down to 0.1, and since 2010, it's gone down to 0.08. So you can see, you can make a case that this is due to the development of regulatory restrictions. It could also be just due to the way the new commercial product is being developed. Period. People want more parking, or they want more open space around the buildings. But for our analysis, we're assuming a 0.1 ratio somewhere in, on that larger trend, given that we know space is at a premium, so we would expect it to be utilized at a slightly higher average. Now, there's also heavy industrial space, the I2 category. It's actually being developed at since 2000, a very low ratio, but that's mainly because there's such little, it's like 32 acres. So the vast majority, almost entirely, is in the I1 light industrial category. So here's some basic facts about what is in the supply for industrial land. 1.1 million of that would be available in the dairy farm, but obviously the dairy farm isn't available today. So whether it's between 3 or 5 years out, when that comes online, that should provide a substantial amount of square footage to meet the demand. Again, recognizing that we have a spread of demand from 1.3 to 5.6 million square feet by 2040. So that's a big chunk. The second big chunk is in expansion area 3. However, expansion area 3 could be developed in other categories of commercial uses. So it's not the same as an I-1 category where it's dedicated space. And also, as we'll talk about a little bit later, it also includes exaction fees, which raises the potential cost of that land for development, but it is still available for industrial space.
Mark, what area is area 3?
It's that parcel. Actually, I'll skip to it's this slide. This is on north side of 75 by Newtown Pike.
Okay,
so is the ED land.
Okay, is any of the Lexmark property?
That's not included in the vacant, but it is a potential for redevelopment.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's about what, 500 acres?
We recognize about 91 acres of potential for industrial development. So that you could get almost 1 million square feet out of there if it was completely redeveloped, if that area was developed to its full potential. But that's a little bit different because it's not actually available. It's being used and owned by someone.
Right.
And so we don't assume that they're going to automatically develop all other non-operational parts of their park.
Well, there have been 2, that they have developed, the FedEx and the Amazon, I believe.
No, right, and we include those, but that's already included as developed in the Amazon property is already included. That is in transition. So you make a good point that does feed part of the supply that there's demand for, but it's not included because it's already kind of allotted for. The other locations that you could have industrial use is the B4 zoning. Most of those are smaller parcels, but there are 2 large parcels on US 27 at the Jessamine County line. They represent the largest B4 zoning, and if you include those or all of them, but including those, you could get about 175 square feet of industrial there. But again, it allows other commercial uses. So it is not likely to be developed as industrial given where it's located. Otherwise, there are only 8 other parcels in the I-1 category over 5 acres, which, according to our conversations with Commerce Lex and others, is the smallest ideal space for attracting a large operation, to market. Now, one of the things that we, could keep in mind, and the things that we've included in scenario 3 is, again, increasing the ratio of square footage on the available land. Like, again, I said, since 2010, they've been using 0.08% of the total area of the land. If they were able to double that, again, that could add up to 2 million square feet of industrial space. So that would be, a contingent on the city and the development community being able to resolve the issues that would make that possible. So the next section is about residential assumptions, and that's where we're going to mainly concentrate on, because as I will show in the end, the retail and office space is generally in pretty good shape, and I'll get to that. But where, industrial is probably the most tenuous in terms of where the demand and the available supply is tightest. And then the next would be residential. Again, our demand range is between 29 and 41,000 new housing units by 2040. When we do our scenario assumptions, some general assumptions are that if there is a new suburban development and the lots are already plotted, but the houses aren't built yet, we're assuming they're going to be built according to those plots. So basically consider it like one dwelling unit per parcel on a plotted lot, a plotted subdivision. For larger unplotted parcels, if there is a development plan, and there are several, and we consulted with the planning staff who gave us those plans, we tried to use those plans. In a few cases, it was clear that there was something that was not correct. So we would have to, revert more likely to what could possibly be on that site. Most of the time it was, the site clearly wasn't big enough to support whatever the plan stated. So we had to obviously use our judgment to make sure what was planned was feasible. And we also understand that these are not, these plans can change. They're just filed. There's no, they haven't not necessarily starting construction, so things can change. In general, 15% of the land is set aside for development inefficiencies, the roads, the setbacks, other aspects that you just have to have when you're developing land. And that includes, in some cases, some of the environmental constraints, but if there is like a significant environmental constraint, we did not develop on that land. We did not include that into our calculations. So an example of how we would incorporate a development plan, and this is a really important, because it's a big one, is in expansion area 2, in the Baptist Health and the Meadowcrest site. And you can see from the map that the FCPS, that's the land on the east side of Polo Club that has been designated for 2 new public schools. But this is what, so this land is conventionally in the inventory of available land, but it has a development plan. And that development plan includes over 1.1 million square feet of a new hospital and 1 million square feet of medical dental office space. We have, having spoken with Baptist Health in other capacities, in KYTC, who is also having to, approve some of the road issues associated with this level of development. There is a concurrence that all that office space will not be developed in the next 20 years. This is a long-term plan, and it's going to develop at a measured rate in that. So we assume 700,000 square feet of office space just on that Baptist Health site by 2040. In addition, it's going to have some retail and hotel components. And so we've included that in our accounting. Similarly, on the north side, you can see that property, the Meadowcrest, that will include a large retirement assisted living facility, as well as apartments, as well as offices and shopping and hotel. So what we do is we account for that land where instead of us guessing, or not guessing, instead of us estimating what the potential for that land is under that zoning clause, we use these figures where we had them. These happen to be pretty detailed, but we got several from, many from the planning staff that cover a broad range of various land parcels in the city. So in scenario 1, again, our assumptions are that these are explicit to scenario 1. So on the infill side, consider it downtown, north, in town, north of downtown, in south of downtown, basically inside of New Circle in the urban core, where there are significant numbers of small infill lots that have just don't have a structure on them. They are available. They are plotted lots, and you can build on them. But we know that a lot of them are somebody's side yard at this point, or they're so small that there's a reason why they haven't been developed yet. So in scenario 1, we assume a conservative redevelopment of those types of lots of 25%. So we're talking out probably around a little less than 600 total lots. We would expect, somewhere, less than about 150 of those over the next 20 years could be redeveloped. For unplotted R3 parcels, and the R3 zoning category is a flexible residential zoning category that can allow single family, but also some multifamily with a development plan, and in consultation with the planning staff, they said that their recent activity within this category, the average was between 10 and 12 units per acre. So we have calculated with 11 units per acre. So for the rural and agricultural urban parcels, if they did not have a development plan, and again, plenty of them do, we assumed 7 dwelling units per acre. So that includes that development and efficiency, and so it's going to be slightly less than that, but that's the general estimate we used. For the expansion area 1, as part of our goal of having multiple scenario distinctions between what could occur on that property, we're leaving it as it is currently zoned, which is low density single family, which is about 3 dwelling units per acre in scenario 1. The other big notation is the UK research farm on Nicholasville Road. We recognize, and this again comes from our conversations with the agricultural stakeholders and the university, that this is an operational farm. It's where they teach, they do research, they do their community outreach to the surrounding counties. It's well located for them. It's a vital part of their operation, and it's a vital part of the prioritization of the ag tech industry. So we are treating it as any other kind of industrial concern in that regard, that it's in operation and their plans are to keep it in operation. Okay, so and then scenario 2, we're now moving forward with the kind of programs, policies that would create more density and flexibility while maintaining the developments that were established in scenario 1. So if there was a development plan for a parcel that we were keeping it, although there may be some density increases if it's not considered something that's going to occur in the very near future. So if there was some notation that said this is 5 years plus, we would expect that maybe these areas would be candidates or are candidates for further density, simply because that's the goal of scenario 1, is to create more density. And so the other aspects of that for increasing the kind of flexibility and density are changing the zone, the code to allow, changing the floor area ratios, changing the parking regulations that would maybe allow more development on the infill sites, and also including mixed use developments in some of the other zoning categories where currently there are none, such as there are some parcels on the periphery of Coldstream, for example, that may be best be a mixed use with some residential components, a small amount. Oh, sorry, wrong way. So the general assumptions here, we now, instead of saying 25%, we're going to say that 50% of the infill lots, of very small infill lots, can be redeveloped. We're now upping the density of unplotted R3 parcels to 17 units per acre. This implies a higher concentration of single family attached, such as townhomes or patio homes, and even apartments. But that's again, the plan is to increase the level of density to get more housing units. And similarly, we increase the density on the agricultural, rural, and urban parcels. And then, like I said, we are increasing these densities as well on proposed developments that are farther out into the future. For Overbrook Farm, expansion area 1, we've gone now from 3 units per acre to 7 to 10 units per acre. It's with a mixture. It's a large parcel, so obviously it will have some sections that have bigger lots than others, but still it's mainly predominantly a single family style development, but now more conventional in its development pattern to other R3 properties. But we do set aside 48 acres, enough for one school and other community amenities, as well as some space, designated open space. And then in the urban core in downtown, where there is zoning for office, office or commercial zoning, we're including more mixed use opportunities to residential downtown, but not like significant, like not a residential tower, but more of a mixed use residences above commercial or office space. So finally, scenario 3, and this builds on scenario 2, but now we're intensifying the development even further to get even greater number of units available. And this is where we're going to have some options. We can use some of these larger scale development projects that we have been proposed in the past, or at least have been identified as sites in the past. And it assumes that this comes along with some of the new, the infrastructure that would be required to allow that to happen. So here, again, this is an intensive infill development strategy. So we're now seeing most of the lots in the infill inner area of the city being developed, still setting aside that some just won't ever, whether it's because the person's, there's no interest, or the lot still remains to be just too difficult to develop. Now we're getting, for the R3 parcels, this is pretty intense, 29 units per acre. That's basically apartment buildings. And that's wherever we have a non-plotted R3 designation. For Overbrook Farm, now we're doing a new urbanist style development. Similar, if you are familiar with Morton Commons outside of Louisville, a range of different types of housing stock, apartments, single family attached, small lots, single family, probably 2 schools, and additional amenities. And in the EA3, the section north of there, or it's the section on the east side of that that is zoned residential, we're increasing the development density to 17 units per acre. And in scenario 3, we have now assumed that UK Research Farm is going to be redeveloped as something else, as proposed in many of the various proposals that we've seen in the recent past. So that would be a mixed use development with both retail and office space, and 50% left in apartment level residential development. So a little bit more details on South Nicholasville Road. That area in the purple again is the property that's currently zoned B4. We expect in scenario 1, it would remain as B4 designation. It could potentially be any type of commercial development, including industrial, but more likely to be office or warehousing. And then in scenario 2, UK Farm remains, but that purple parcel is now more of a mixed use development with more retail style commercial, more office and residential. And you can see how we now can move up from no dwelling units in scenario 1 to almost 1,000 in scenario 2. And then in scenario 3, this more intensive development plan, we've increased the densities to be very high, that's almost to the level of that transit-oriented development level. And you can see the dwelling units now are over 2,600 with 1.1 million square feet of office space available. For expansion area 3, again, in scenario 1 and 2, we're leaving it the way it is, where it could be variable for any, the industrial and commercial side, it could be any number of different things. But on the residential side, you can see the increase in residential density from 7 units per acre on this larger green parcel here, and then There was a development plan for a multifamily on this smaller green parcel down here. And we are suggesting like a gradual increase in densities on both, so that you could go from 842 as of the current zoning to over 2,000 in the more aggressive scenario 3. And then Overbrook Farm, again, at the low, the Overbrook Farm consists of everything below Armstrong Mill, including this area that was already in the urban service boundary. The orange line represents what was included in expansion area 1, but all of it is available for development according to the premise of agricultural land inside the urban service boundary is available for development. So in the basic plan, the scenario 1, it's 3 dwelling units per acre. You get about 2,200 units. If you increase it to what is still less than what the most current densities that are occurring in R3, but probably more consistent with its surroundings to the west, you get 6,200 units per acre, so 4,000 more units. And then if we were to do something similar to a Norton Common style development, we could get almost over 9,000 units. So those are just examples. That's basically what we have for scenario 3. And I want to quickly show, like, this is the table that shows how we compare to the demand to the supply. And so these numbers are equivalent to what's in these charts. Charts are a little bit easier to understand, so I'll start there. And basically, I'll start with the easier or the less contentious side, in the sense that just by doing the math on what we do in scenario 1, we pretty much show we have enough available land designated for retail, even for the highest level of expected demand. When we make some changes, when we shift some commercial lands to involve more mixed uses to allow residential, we take a little bit away, but basically, by the time in scenario 3, the increased densities basically leave the total top number about the same. And then in office space, because of the space that's available downtown and available in other places that are currently designated as for commercial uses and for that market class, you can see in all scenarios we are well above what we would expect on the higher side of full demand. And really, what I think is in reality what is going to happen is, a lot of these zoning categories allow any number of variety of mixture or types of interplay between retail and office. So if you take them together, you just add them all up, and you say the full demand for retail and office combined is a little, like 9.6 million square feet. You can see we're comfortably around 12 million square feet of retail and office. And that's not even including the potential for redeveloping older spaces on commercial corridors that could be redeveloped at a higher intensity than they are now. This is just talking about what's available on vacant land. So in that regard, our concern remains how to find enough space for industrial and residential. And here again, you can see how the basic math plays out for those categories. As you can see, if we just followed the trend line for the conservative number of expectation of 29,000 residential units, in scenario 1, we're close, but we're not above it. We're at 27,000 versus 29,000. By scenario 2, the efforts as implied by Imagine Lexington to increase density, increase flexibility to get more units available, we come close to what Imagine Lexington was projecting in their in the 2018 estimate for 2040, which they were actually projecting to 2035 in their document. But they were clearly following the same extrapolation trend line from the state data center, that gets us to the need for 41,000 households. We just by doing what we've done now, we get to 40,000. So if you consider that we're likely somewhere in between 29 and 41, scenario 2 generally covers, simply by increasing densities, what is the higher end for residential. However,
Mark, and this design period is over 10 years, or the demand period is over 10 years,
20 years.
20 years. Okay. Thank you.
In scenario 3, where we really ramp up the intensity, you can see like there's the potential for 50,000 units, well above what would be needed by the higher trend line for residential population. There you can see that our evaluation matrix will have something, some distinction between that basic criteria of, do we have enough? In scenario 1, we are close we're below the bottom of our range. In scenario 2, we're close to the top of our range. In scenario 3, we're above. And that's just that one particular metric. For example, for industrial, again, you can see like the radically different demand range we have if you just based it on what was brought online in the last 10 versus 20 years. Again, this number is probably naturally somewhere in the middle, somewhere like less than constrained by the urban service boundary, and given the inventory that was built up before, and also just the market conditions for the type of industrial development that is occurring regionally and even nationally. So it is a simplistic notion to say that it will be, double. We're just going to double what we did from year 2000 to 2020. But that's what we did from year 2000 to 2020. So 5.6 million is like that full range. And what you can see is we really don't have that industrial space in scenarios 1 or 2 if we use the assumptions that we're going to keep developing at the rate, the ratio of land to acreage to square footage that we have in the past. It also assumes that we are developing on smaller parcels than perhaps is truly ideal, parcels that are on average 3 acres instead of the ideal 5 plus. However, in scenario 3, we are proposing that if we increased the ratio of square footage on an acre to 0.16, which is still less than the county-wide average, but more than the recent average, we could almost get to that. We would get to like 5.3, 5.4 million, which is pretty much close to the top. So again, here's the numbers, like for like the demand versus the supply, and it's in the packet, but that's basically where we're talking about. And so now we get to the real option that we would like to get your decision on, which is incorporation of identified potential development sites. So in some cases, we have already done that with the South Farm property, with Overbrook Farm, with EA3. We've made some assumptions for higher levels of development. But then there are all these infill catalyst sites that have been identified in other studies, including Lexmark, as you can see there. Corridor studies, the redevelopment of Richmond Road and Nicholasville Road, for example, the redevelopment of Red Mile. And while we've identified these sites from previous proposals, Cynthia has done like a professional judgment of what their maximum development potential is. That this is an aggregate total. If you went all in and developed it all at the full level, this is probably what you could squeeze out of it. And that includes, again, perhaps up to 1 million square feet of industrial space at Lexmark. Now, we are not proposing that we pick one of these projects to say, let's include it. What we're proposing is saying, if we know that the total number of dwelling units possible is in the ballpark of 9,000, and we know the total commercial square feet is in the ballpark of 8 million, what proportion of this should we consider including as a part of our scenario 3. And in that regard, we have a basic option. We can not include any of it and just use the increased densities that we've applied. Basically, from scenario 2 to scenario 3, we just increased densities to get to 50,000 units for residential, for example. Another option would be to use take the scenario 3 and just add on to it, and add even more dwelling units to scenario 3. And then, the third option, which is the one we're recommending, which is, set the target of the total number of units that we're trying to hit. And then once we've set that target, set the proportion of how much of this development potential we want to incorporate, and then lower the densities on the vacant parcels to be the equivalent of that target. So if we want to take, for example, half of the development potential, which I would say would be at the top range of what you would expect to see in the next 20 years, right? I mean, this isn't all going to happen like in 20 years. If you took half of that and you said, okay, that's 4,500 dwelling units, we could decrease the general densities for areas in the R3 category and the agricultural categories to like back out 4,500 units and stick to our total target of 50,000 units for scenario 3. So ultimately, the question I'm asking is, one, do you accept or do you have a preference for the target of 50,000 units? And then two, how much of this infill development should we be considering? And then three, should it be additive or should it be balanced to hit that specific target? And I understand that's a little convoluted, so if please feel free to ask me any particular question, but I'm going to stop there and hopefully get some discussion on that topic. Because the main reason why is we really do want to go ahead and move forward so that we can try to maintain a schedule to have our evaluations done by, something for you on the evaluation framework side by next month. And in order to do that, we really need to kind of settle on our scenarios.
Can you quit sharing the screen so we can see?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Any hands that come up, please? Thank you. If you would like to ask a question, if you would please raise your hand. Frank. Frank, you're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Mark, when you were doing the housing considerations, are you taking into the demographics of what we're going forward with, what they project that our demographics will be going forward, the age we're getting older?
In general terms, yes. In specific terms, no. We weren't trying to specifically track a particular housing type to a particular age demographic. That will be a part of the evaluation matrix, more likely, but that's where it will be more prevalent, because as we increase these densities, we are making there's a very direct presumption of the types of housing that are involved or included. So we will know the change in the mix of housing by just knowing what types of housing is possible at certain levels of densities.
Thanks, Mark.
Any other questions? Bryce, you're on
Yes.
mute.
Two quick questions. One clarification. So are you looking for, let's say, we want to support residential scenario 3, industrial scenario, whatever, commercial scenario X? It's not all 1, all 2, all 3. Is that fair, Mark?
I'm not asking, at no point am I asking for you guys to tell us now your preference on scenario 1, 2, or 3. What I'm asking for is assent to test these scenarios against specific metrics of how we measure how many units each scenario has. We measure how much available, how the levels of affordability, whether it meets these targets, whether it, the types of housing units that require accessibility issues, all the stuff that we're going to measure these scenarios against. So it's not a pick your favorite scenario. For scenario 3, I am asking it's a little bit more open-ended as to what's possible, because we're now kind of we're moving into some of these higher level points. How much do we want to include of infill versus non-infill? How dense do we want to go forward? Because we've already gone past, in my mind, the higher range of potential population. So now we're doing a more full build out scenario, and it's reasonable to set a target of how high should we go, and how should we do that mix.
So to follow up on that, are you meaning scenario 3 across the board, or scenario 3 in just residential, or scenario 3 in just industrial?
Well, generally in just residential, but it is possible to parse it by the other categories. But really, it would just simply be, I think, at this point, the questions involving industrial would be: do you accept the premise of increasing the ratio for industrial land development, and do you accept the premise that we could potentially use Lexmark as a potential site for additional? I mean, if you were to say that I don't think that that's possible, like that would be kind of a false assumption, don't use it, then that's good to know. We won't. We could still use Lexmark for other kind of commercial property, like warehousing or residential or whatever, but it is available. It's I-1. So in that sense, it's like, if we have an issue with industrial land, it's a suitable site. But the other issue for industrial land, I think probably critical that we do want an opinion on is it acceptable to assume a higher ratio, 1.6 or something higher than the current 0.1?
And thank you for clarifying. I did have one question. I'm sorry to jump back, but what I didn't see in the scenario discussions was incorporating the urban 3 data and the kind of the payroll per acre and some of those, I guess specifically the payroll per acre, and trying to concentrate on what is working in a payroll per acre and bringing that forward. So I just wanted to understand how that's incorporated in the various scenarios of what we've done.
So thank you for that question. That is because that is a metric. That is once we have these, we're gonna get the cost benefit, or the cost revenue cost ratio for the current existing condition today, and then we're going to apply the same rubric to get that metric for each of these scenarios, and that'll be one of the things that we use as an evaluation. Which of these scenarios does that cost, or that ratio versus cost flatter? Which looks better for each of these scenarios? So we have not done that analysis explicitly yet, because I don't want to turn urban 3 loose until you agree on what we should be having them analyze.
Okay, thank you. I guess that was a good follow-up clarification. I appreciate it.
Right.
Don Robinson has a question. Don, you're on mute. Don, you're on mute.
Can you hear me?
Now.
Oh, great.
Now, gotcha.
Sorry. Mark, I would encourage you all to be, with your look, to be very aggressive with the infill, to look at scenario 3. I mean, I think that's part of the exercise. Again, I think in a lot of ways, we're just kind of turning around in a boat, because what this task force really needs to do is, what are the triggers for expansion?
Right.
I mean, what are the triggers for expansion, the costs, and when do we really expand? From all the data I've seen, it doesn't look like we have in the foreseeable future any necessity to expand, from looking at the numbers here. On the industrial, I would definitely encourage you to look at Lexmark and all the potential sites. Now, when I was on planning commission, we downzoned industrial land because they said there was no need for it. This was, 15 years ago. So now there seems, I'm hearing a need. I mean, it took Bluegrass Park, 25 years to fill that place out. So I would strike me that we do have the land, and if we're a smart community, we can make this work with the land we have. So yeah, I think Stantec really owes it to the job to look at, to look at these scenarios. If we go to scenario 1, we've sort of reversed. We've sort of failed as a community. We aren't doing that right now. So I think this is a look to the future and how we can maximize this finite land. So that would be my encouragement.
Mark, do you want to address the means to the end as far as getting to the matrix with the exercise we're going through?
Yeah, so again, the basic framework is we set up these scenarios, we identify like the metrics that we're going to study. I mean, the biggest one obviously is the availability of land inventory, but then there are other issues, and I can bring up a slide that I produced for the discussion purposes, and we can get to that now. I do want to have some kind of resolution to that option for scenario 3 before this call is over. But basically, when we talk about, again, we are not evaluating an expansion alternative. We're evaluating build out scenarios. However, under the premise of that, there are going to be indicators where there are we are creating an evaluation process that should turn on lights that say we are approaching an issue that may involve the need to expand. We had a call yesterday with Greg and Craig and I, and they asked this is coming. The premise is we're going to have a bunch of indicators, and they're going to include issues that are based on total land availability, how we're meeting employment, like are we meeting all the space for employees, are we meeting the space for obviously residents, how our development pattern compares to colleague metro areas, how our development pattern compares to surrounding counties. But ultimately, if we were just concerned with the question of what would bring on the need to expand, the $64,000 question is, do you have enough land based on the trend lines you're seeing of land consumption versus the time horizon that you're setting? So right now we're setting a 20-year time horizon. That's what the comp plan is intended to do, is to say, like, we're looking 20 years into the future, and are we planning for 20 years? And Imagine Lexington said, we have enough land in the urban service boundary for 20 years. So that was the existential question that we have to answer. We have the vacant land analysis. As I showed in the scenario 1, we're close on everything on the conservative trend line, except for residential. If we just developed, again, I'm not proposing we just develop according to what's on the books today, but if we just use those land limitations, the way it's set today, we get close, but we wouldn't actually get to that 29,000. So you could say that if you knew we were on this trajectory of scenario 1, you'd have a trigger that would say, like, we might need to expand in order to meet the need for residential housing. However, if you're on the trajectory of scenario 2, you won't cross that threshold at the same point, and you may find that you have enough land beyond 20 years. So what are some of the other criteria that we would expect to see? And again, it goes to, how is our growth relating to what we are expecting? If we see our population increasing at a significantly higher rate than we have in the recent past, then we need to change our growth presumption. Similarly, if we're seeing employment shifts, whether that's in the form of vacancies or just total number of jobs, commuters coming into the community. Similarly, if you're seeing these dramatic shifts in housing costs, that it's not just relatable to, of course, peripheral counties are going to be less expensive than, older urban neighborhoods in the center of the metro. But if you see some other like notable shift in the rents and the housing costs, that could be a demonstration that you're not being able to meet your needs for a particular class. And then finally, again, one other metric that could be an indicator would be, is your commuting pattern dramatically changing? And this is, and again, we're saying how it's changing in a very substantial way, and not in just the normal way you would expect a growing metro to always have an interplay with its surrounding counties. But you could look at other places like San Francisco, for example, where people are coming from a lot farther away than you would naturally assume. And a lot of that has to do with a specific housing problem. So we're going to look at that in the sense of how these different scenarios would address those kind of conditions. But really what we're trying to do is create this framework so that you can, as we go through the framework next year and in 3 years or whatever, we're paying attention to these trend lines. We're paying attention to what's changing, and we can say, oh, our land use classes or land inventory is keeping up or not keeping up. And then, we were talking about, again, yesterday, a lot of this is coming from yesterday. And so I'm kind of skipping to the punch here, but, what would be the conditions under which we would expect expansion to be something that would be reasonable or possible? It would be like, if you don't have it, if we all agree, if the policy folks agree that there's insufficient of inventory, and you can find land that suitably addresses that identified need. So for example, residential, you need, like, everything points to that we don't have enough to meet our time horizon goal. So we want to set aside an expansion area for residential. So it has to be for that. Alternatively, we say we just need something similar to the dairy farm in addition to the dairy farm or something like that. It has to be for industrial. Our framework would be applying that urban growth or that urban 3 style analysis as another condition that says, does this make sense? Like, we expand, but if it turns out to be, just a fiscal burden on the city, or there are other costs involved that even though we might need it, it's still not worth the expansion to do it. That's a trigger that has to be met. And then finally, this is kind of comes back from last month, something Mr. Anderson proposed, and something that we've been talking about before you even said that, is because if there is actually a commitment to do what you said, what we need to be done. So it's not just open-ended that, oh, we expand it and then let's see what happens. It's like, we know we need this style of development to address this particular insufficiency. Okay, you found the parcel. Can you negotiate? And it makes sense. Now, can you negotiate a plan to get it done so that you know what you're getting in the end? That's that's the very short form of what I think the framework is intended to help future analyses accomplish. For us, we're developing the framework, and we have 3 specific scenarios, and we're limited to just the building out the urban service inside the urban service line. But these different scenarios will give us different, we'll record different values on our when we do the metrics on them, and we will be able to say that, like, again, maybe scenario 1 would require would run out of land, and therefore that's something to consider about that type of development pattern. Maybe that's why scenario 2, which is more efficient in its development pattern, would be the preferable action. But if you did scenario 2, you would have to expect to do these things, increased zoning, increased infill development. Otherwise, if you don't do those things, you're not really on scenario 2. And then finally, you could be on the trajectory of scenario 3. You could end up saying like, we are so determined to maximize the efficiency of land that we're upzoning everything. We're actively trying to redevelop infill development parcels. And if you see yourself on that trajectory, when you get to these indicators, you should find that you have sufficient land inventory for going forward. And the whole idea is you keep repeating this process over and over again, and you know where you are, and you know, like, and you can start making rational estimations of when you will actually run out. And that's the idea.
Okay, Mark, we've got a couple questions.
Sure.
Dennis was first, I think.
I don't have a question. I got a comment. I can appreciate the forward looking of scenario 2 and 3, but we have a housing shortage today in Fayette County. And while we're working through these scenarios and seeing if they work or if they don't work, if the land's available or it isn't available, what are we going to do? The Lexmark, we talked about that. It has some environmental contamination issues. The South Park Shopping, I've met with them about doing residential there. I was really excited. And I went out to meet with them. This was a couple of years ago. And the land on the left where TGI Fridays, I thought, wow, that'd be a great spot to do independent living or something of that nature. And you'd get a lot of density. But what they were interested in was over the detention in the back. And you could get maybe 50, 60 townhomes in there. Doesn't create the economy of scale to where you can put professional management and a nice amendment pack or amenity package. The Red Mile, I've met with them, and they don't seem to be real motivated to do anything. The university's property, they don't seem to be motivated to do anything. There's a lot of things we've got in here. It's going to be tough to see it to come to fruition. And it's not going to come to fruition now. It's going to be several years down the road. Now, I really like the scenario 2 and 3. I feel like I'm a scenario 2 or 3 developer. But I'd see that, are we going to be able to execute these in the immediate future and take care of our community needs? Again, I want to close by saying we have a housing shortage in Fayette County today. And I'm concerned about years 0 to 5.
Oh, thank you. And I think that was one of the issues, if I recall, was what we need more discussion, or the task force was needs more discussion to talk about how to do that short-term time frame. And that's I'll let Ann and Greg lead that off if they want to now. But again, I did some. Ann asked me to just for the purposes of communication. I have a couple of slides about what are the barriers to development, what are the incentives to development. And mainly this comes from the idea that we have land inside the urban service boundary that is prime for being developed, but is not getting developed. And Ann had asked me to kind of just come up with a list of what might be the reasons why and what might be some incentives to get that land in the pipeline to actually get developed. So we can talk about that now or later. I would like to get the scenario 3 thing kind of on the, resolved so I can know how to go forward first. But
before we move on to that, Mark, I think we need to resolve the scenario 3 assumption that you're proposing. Is 50% of those properties acceptable? I personally think it's rather aggressive. It would be lovely to think.
Well, that's why
scenario 3 is supposed to be aggressive.
Yeah. But it also doesn't need to be 50%. I mean, that's what I think. I think it's somewhere in the range of 25 to 50. And again, we're not even going to try to say it's going to happen at Richmond Road and this much is going to happen at Lexington Green and this is going to happen at Lexmark. We're just saying, like, if you said, make that trade-off of some infill development in versus the just increased density.
Well, what's wrong with saying 33% if you say it's somewhere between 25 and 50?
Oh, nothing. You tell me.
What's everybody think? Is everybody okay with 33? Vice Mayor?
Yeah, Vice Mayor.
Thank you. It would help me in thinking about this if, Mark, you would explain the two options and how they affect the actual criteria. What difference does it make if we go with option A as opposed to option B in terms of developing either criteria or matrix? How does it play out?
Well, so like, for example, well, obviously one unit, the main metric unit will be like, how many units do you get out of? And we'll break that down by the types of units, right? So we might see as, whereas if we had a slightly more units in the R3 categories on vacant land, we could assume that that type of unit is either small lot residential or a single family attached. But if it was something along the lines of imagine Nicholasville Road, it's probably more like an apartment. So that would be we would get a different metric of the type of units that are implied by whether it's an infill versus a suburban style development. Then you can talk about metrics including accessibility. Like if you're building out of the periphery, you're probably farther away from the transit lines, probably not as close as opportunities on a ratio of people for shopping or work. While we include, we are including the development potential for commercial and retail development where vacant land is available, and even where there's some redevelopment opportunities along the original corridors. You could still imagine that infill development that's inside, that's explicitly inside Man of War, inside of New Circle, will have a different level of accessibility. And you'd also just when we do traffic metrics, it could change the whether the degree, the need or degree of congestion or need for capacity for traffic. So those are the kind of metrics where it could make a difference. Now, as far as the total unit number, that's kind of where I need some concurrence or some agreement about like, well, because we could keep adding on and on and on, but what becomes unrealistic. And I believe, like, given that that our target is around 42,000 at the high end, no more than 50 would probably be necessary, and it could even be lower. But we don't necessarily want to. We could show the difference. We could see a difference in the valuation if we had it at a significantly distinct difference from scenario 2.
I think can you share your screen again with scenario 3?
I'm sorry.
Potential. I think that would be helpful to see.
So, but anyway, so that's how I would view it, is that the main difference would be the more we have an infill versus peripheral development, our metrics could be more akin to, how does this affect existing neighborhoods? How does this affect the location of schools or services? How does it affect accessibility? And so I definitely believe that it should be included. The question is, to what degree do we want to include it? Because it does seem, I don't want to imply that it's all going to happen, but I want to imply that some of it is part of scenario 3. And if my recommendation is we set the cap at 50 because that's high enough, and then we incorporate some of this infill development and balance it by lowering the density on the vacant land.
Okay, so if we take that recommendation, what it means is that the trigger for actually making a decision would be lower for residential and higher for everything else? Or am I?
Yes, so like you would see higher levels of because since these are considered mixed use developments, it would be assuming that you would see higher levels of commercial, office, and retail as a result.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Can we go back to, thank you, Mark. Can you go
Sure.
back to not sharing your screen so we can see hands and so on? Who?
Frank,
Muted.
You're muted.
I'm unmuted now. I want to make the assumption, and I agree with Dennis, you know, it's going to be 2 or 3. We're not going back to 1. We haven't done that. I mean, that'd be a step backwards for sure. But I don't understand this business of the fact that we got to have more industrial land until the dairy farm comes online. If you go back and look at the use of industrial property in Fayette County over the last 20 years, that doesn't support that argument. So I don't understand why we're that concerned about industrial land, because if you go back and look at what I just said, you know, we've got enough to bridge the gap to get the University of Kentucky land on. So I don't put a lot of stock in that. As far as the housing thing goes, you know, we're at the point right now where I hope we're getting staff input. You know, I hesitate to even say this because I haven't talked to our staff. But it looks to me like when we get down to whether we ought to use 50% or 25% or 30%, I'd like to know what our planning staff feels about that, because I think that's an important consideration.
And I also think that our infrastructure, it plays a big role in that as well.
Absolutely. And I think the way we would measure it is, because again, these are hypothetical. I can't tell you which will develop, right? And each one of them is going to have a very explicit infrastructure issue to deal with on these particular sites. But what I can suggest is that in general, the more you go to the center, the older the infrastructure and the relative more upgrade you'll need, just because it's already in need of upgrade as you go out. So what I would suggest is that we set a certain level of major infill development that we were saying will require major infrastructure upgrades to handle that we would blend that with some that's in the center and some that's on the periphery, that's newer infrastructure that could be accounted for at a lower cost. So a higher cost, some at a higher cost and some at a lower cost. And again, as you get a more explicit plan, you can run the development, you can run the framework with the more explicit information. But we don't want to imply in this scenario like one explicit plan per se, unless you give us direction that that's what you want us to do.
And Dennis, I know you've got a question real quickly. Craig, are we going to get bumped at 3 p.m.? We've got 15 minutes until then. Pardon me?
My understanding is that this will continue until we manually stop the meeting. So
Okay.
that's my hope that will occur. If I can just respond to Mr. Penn had a great comment about getting the input from the planning division. That is something we're doing. The project team has been meeting with planning staff on a pretty regular basis to get that input. But we're also, to the point, we're also just wanting to make sure that we're getting your direct input as well. We're bringing all of that back and having those discussions with planning and others, but wanted to make sure that, again, that we're receiving your direct input as much as possible toward the completion of this study.
Thank you. But I think, can we get to
I would
Dennis?
just like, you all ready for me?
Yeah, Dennis, and then we'll
I'd
go.
like to make a comment about the absorption of industrial land. Fayette County, we don't have a government-owned industrial land. The surrounding counties do. And they sell this land for $25,000 and $50,000 an acre, which is pretty much giving it away. The private sector cannot bring land to the market at that price. But the surrounding counties, they do that so they get the payroll tax off of it. So if we really want industrial land in Fayette County that can compete with other county, it's going to need to be a local government owned industrial park. And then you'll see the absorption pick up, I believe.
Isn't that what the dairy farm is going to be?
It is the industrial authority will oversee that development, the 200 acres. And we're currently undergoing the master planning efforts for that as well.
Okay, thank you.
Cynthia, did you have a question, I believe?
I didn't have a question. I just wanted to add on something that I know Mark intended to talk about, but given the amount of information he's conveyed. I just wanted to talk about the fact that once the 2020 census is released and we have a better understanding of where we really are with our population and our demographics and our true growth, we'll have to, we being the client, will ultimately have to sort of retool that low and that high, because we're assuming what those values are today based on
Right.
historical demographic data. So I just wanted to get that out there before we all forget about it.
Thank you,
clarification.
Cynthia. That's a good point. I just want to add one thing to that. That's why we kind of consider this the dry run of trying to get the framework developed. So, because next year, when you go through the comp planning process, you'll have better data. And we want to make sure that when that starts, that we already have the process set up so that you can input the better data. And so we're trying to test the framework against these three conceptual hypothetical scenarios, so that when you actually have real scenarios that you really want to adopt or not adopt, that you have the framework and we've tested it first.
Okay, Amanda, I think Amanda has a question.
Thank you, ma'am. I wanted to reiterate two things. One, Cynthia, I had the same thought about the demographics and the census, so I'm glad you brought that up. And then two, Mark, let me just make sure I heard what you said about scenario 3 as an example. That would be that Norton Commons is an example of a scenario 3 type development in the expansion zone, correct?
Expansion area 1, we are proposing like a development pattern equivalent to like a newer urbanist style community. Yeah.
Okay, I've been to that development, and I think it is fascinating. And I think it's an incredibly, I think it's pretty amazing. I think it'd be great for us to do something like that here. I think that makes sense though in the expansion areas. I think for an infill type project, we don't have the space for that, quite frankly, maybe. And so I guess my only feedback on the scenarios 2 versus 3 is that I think the scenario 3 for expansion areas that are new makes sense. And I think based on some of the conversations we've been having on zone changes just lately, tells me that in theory, they all want that, but not an infill type development projects. That feels far more like a zone 2 or scenario 2 type density, if you will. And that's just my feeling. That's just based on comments we hear from neighbors when they're talking about the apartment complex, the development, the condos, the whatever. When it's an infill, density 3 or scenario 3 feels a lot more intense to people than I think that they're ready for. And that's just my feeling. Just want to share it.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's a reasonable assessment of like what you see. And I mean, that's the main difference. Is this process is part of it is the quantitative numbers. The other part of it is understanding, how palatable it is to the community, and they can decide whether that kind of density is something that they're willing to accept or not. I mean, that goes back to our conversations with the neighborhood association. It's that delicate balance of preserve our neighborhoods but create more affordable housing. Like don't change our neighborhoods. If you want to create the density, if you want to create the affordable housing, something has to change. If you're going to stay in this boundary, if that's really the constraint we find ourselves in.
How do we answer Stantec's question as far as what percentage between 25 and 30 do we direct him to utilize in him creating scenario 3? Specifically, it would be a percentage of the, I'll call them, properties that have redevelopment potential that are currently utilized for other purposes, meaning Fayette Mall, Crossroads Center, Lexington Green, those pieces. I find it very aggressive to think 33% would be redeveloped. I find that extremely aggressive, but hey, is that okay with everybody for Mark to use? Lynn?
Thank you, Greg. This is just a whole lot coming at us, and we've not seen anything written, any kind of documentation other than the PDFs that we get. a couple of days in advance. And I don't feel really equipped to be able to provide meaningful guidance to Stantec at this point. And I would yield all of my voting power to the long-range planning staff, because these are the people who are living and breathing this stuff on a daily basis, as well as the Stantec folk. And I appreciate and honor, appreciate that Stantec wants to honor us, Craig, that you want to honor the task force members, but I really don't feel equipped to be able to make that kind of a judgment call.
I don't need it.
Greg,
Yeah.
is that something that long-term planning folks could answer?
I mean, they can have an opinion about it for sure. I mean, and it's, I mean, their opinion would be, you know, an educated one.
Certainly, if that's the direction of this task force, we're glad to bring that particular question back to planning and discuss that with them and report back to you all if that would be acceptable.
Frank?
I think we have to do that. I'm like Lynn, I'm not comfortable to make that decision without having some discussion with our long-range planning staff. And I appreciate the fact that Craig and them have met with them, but that doesn't educate us.
Right.
And so we need the benefit of their input.
Yeah.
It's fine that Stantec has it, but we need it before we can give them any kind of direction.
Yeah. I also wanted to ask if I could, I mean, we've got basically another 2.5 months of this project. And I wondered, are we going to be getting some kind of written report?
Yes.
I work best with something that I can take my pencil and, you know, kind of, you know, dog-ear pages. And, you know, again, we're coming to the end of the line, and we're being asked for some big decisions. And I really don't feel like I have the knowledge to be able to deliver a good recommendation.
So Mark, can we say at this point in time, we're going to defer to long-range planning staff's recommendation?
Well,
And then and then they will also report back to us at the next meeting what that recommendation was, so we can agree with it. Is that a reasonable answer? I just want to give Tim an answer.
no. I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
Okay.
I
Amanda,
apologize. I thought I was on mute. I'm sorry. That was a little more forceful, but I mean, with all due respect, and I want to be mindful of my comments. I have a great deal of respect for our planning staff and for everyone in this task force, but the goal here is to do something different. And I would say 33% is too aggressive. I would lean toward the smaller amount of the percentage, just based on sheer feedback from neighbors and council members, and in terms of what they're comfortable with. I'd rather provide that direction because, quite frankly, I'm the one that's getting that. The planning staff is not. That's just me personally, and I always speak for myself in this. But you know, when the zone changes come up, they're all for this kind of development infill, but they all have limits on it. They don't want 3 stories. They don't want too much. They want more downsizing. They want transitions. They want more, you know, add on, and they're all reasonable. These are not unreasonable requests. But the challenge is, how do you balance both of those things? And I think for purposes of planning, we should not bank on saying we're going to do that and not meeting that goal. Because what we typically, it seems like we've done, is we've said, yes, do this. And then we come to council, we come to planning commission, and then we make all these different changes to help make it more palatable to the infill portion, but at the expense of then the density and the cost. And then it increases the housing costs of those units, or retail, or anything else for that matter, or the land, sheer land, and then it doesn't provide us what we're looking for. And that would be my encouragement, to go the less, not the high, in terms of planning. That's just me, and I trust the professionals, because I'm certainly not one.
Councilperson, I'm in agreement with you that council is going to have a very hard time accepting scenario 3 in general, is my feeling, but we'll see. Frank, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I don't disagree with that analysis. What I think Amanda's not taking consideration is the planning commission is sending some kind of recommendation to you. And so you have the benefit of the councils, of the planning staff's input, because the planning commission has gotten it and put it in their decisions. What my concern here is now is that I want to know the input for the long range of what either one of these scenarios do, based on what our experts say they are, not the Stantec expert, but the people we work with every day. And we don't have the benefit of that knowledge, yet we're asked to give you direction. I'm not prepared to say whether it ought to be 22, 25, or 33, because I don't know. So, you know, I want the same information as Stantec said as a committee member here, in order before I can make the same decision or make a decision.
May I make, may I make a point? Again, the point isn't that we're trying to say one is better than the other. We're trying to say, tell us what to study. You know, like tell us like if you tell us to like parse between two things that are equivalently the same, like we won't be able to give you a framework that can give you any distinction. And so these are hypothetical. I'm not implying that this is going to happen. What will happen will be the land development plans that you all use this framework to literally evaluate. So while I am perfectly amenable to the notion of having the planning staff sign off on these questions, I mean, that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. It's not that like I'm making the decision, like just trust me. Like, because what I'm saying is I want to just start with a conceptual idea and run it through a test. And that's what but I want to know what you guys would prefer me to test, something that's way more aggressive or something that's just aggressive. And so like, I mean, we can wait a little bit, we can talk to planning and get their feedback, and that's fine. But it's not me saying like, oh, I think this is what's going to happen, let's go with this, you know, like everybody will buy it. I mean, I think what we're trying to show is like when we do these various scenarios, we get, you know, significantly different results from our analysis.
And Mark, I also wanted to clarify that we've already assumed only a certain proportion or certain percentage of each of these redevelopment areas actually gets developed. So it's not as if we're assuming 100% of each parcel gets developed across the board. The amount of redevelopment potential is scaled back based on the available land that's there and maybe too much parking that's there. So it's already scaled back in terms of total potential. It's just a question of how many of these sites, and certainly with Dennis Anderson's input of, you know, he's talked to these folks, there's not too much interest, but maybe there's possibility for other locations. And so that's where the proportion of all of them come into play. Is it 10%, 20%, 30%? But it's really a percentage of a percentage, if you know what I mean. It's not 30% or 100% of 100%. So.
Vice Mayor.
Thank you, Ann. So I need to go back again to the question I asked. So Mark, you said it would make a difference on what you study. Can you unpack that for me a little bit? What difference will it actually make if we today say alternative A as opposed to alternative B in what your work is?
Well, it would, the main difference would be, would we be just testing more of a higher density scenario on vacant and developable land, like undeveloped land, versus one that truly implies a new infill development, and we will have the criteria that reflect that distinction. So it just becomes the question of like, how much do we want to where do we want to draw that line? Because there's a certain level that you could, I would agree that 50,000 new dwelling units inside the urban service boundary in the next 20 years is it's a hypothetical aggressive number. So, and you could do that in any number of ways, but the two most fundamental ways you can do it is either on loading up on the undeveloped land or doing infill development. And we've already trying to use the small infill parcels in each of these scenarios at different degrees. Now we have to, if we wanted to really test infill development versus the suburban or the peripheral development, we need to know, how much of that infill development is truly, that we would truly think is possible or reasonable to put in. And that's the thing. So I think if it's me, I don't like the idea of going higher than 50. And I could accept any percentage that you wanted. Like I wouldn't take any more than 50%. I mean, I agree with everybody else. It's probably closer to 25%. But if the goal of the task force was to say, no, we want scenario 3 to be a heavily invested infill development scenario, then this is the question that I want to get resolved. Yes, yes, we do, or no, we don't really. And if
So
you said,
is it fair to say that a part of what you're looking for is enough distinction from scenario 2?
yes,
Yes.
And the question is, how much of a distinction are we willing to make? And-
correct.
Okay, so I would be, it's my personal opinion, I would agree with you. I would be conservative in your estimation for scenario 3, because if we're going to get pushback, that's where we're going to get it. And the higher the percentage, the greater the pushback. And it's a scenario. I mean, this is a part of what I keep thinking. This is a scenario. This is not a plan that the city is going to execute in toto. It depends on independent actors, a lot of them. Some of them are already at the table. And so it's theoretical, and we need to be careful about what that says about what the intention is. So that's my
And I
2
would
cents.
also, thank you. And I would also go farther. You don't have to say, take 50,000. That was just something that we were doing the math, and like, we were trying to, again, push the limits to like, well, eventually, I mean, think about it this way. We have this parcel. It could be small lot, single family houses. It could be single family attached houses, or it could be apartment buildings. Well, we went all the way to the edge and made it apartment buildings, but that's how we got to 50,000. But if the task force says like, hey, that's probably going a little bit too far out on the limb, make it 45,000 or make it even less, we can do that as well. I mean, it's more that I want to go, I would like, to your point, Vice Mayor, to have a distinction between scenario 2 and 3. I would like that distinction to be heavily favored towards the notion that scenario 3 invests in like more of these infill development style projects than just changes to rezoning and slight, like tweaks here and there that create more density, but otherwise follows the same pattern. So that's why, we've talked about scenario 3, including these kind of projects, but it's just a question of how much, how intense, and to what total level.
And I think I would like to add on, Mark, just for a little bit of clarification, in that the idea that why we're asking this question at all, for obvious reasons, is that if everybody on the task force says, well, even though there's all these plans for Nicholasville Road and Red Mile and Lexmark and all these places that have been identified through the planning staff, through Fayetteville Alliance and everybody else, that these are potential redevelopment sites, if everybody on the committee feels that, yeah, they've been identified, but we really don't think that they're ever going to happen, or at least they're not going to happen in the 20-year time period, well, then we sort of have a different direction that we need to go in order to make sure that we have sufficient land and sufficient land uses to accommodate growth. But on the other hand, if you feel that as a community, you want to embrace that redevelopment opportunity, and maybe not on all the sites and maybe not 100% of each site, but that the community as a whole wants to move forward with new urbanist type development on infill properties within the urban services boundary, we just need to know that that's how you'd like to move forward. And then we will build it out in a different way through testing the matrices that we're coming up with. That's kind of the fundamental question in a heartbeat.
I think that the Vice Mayor has an important point, that how aggressive is too aggressive, where it's where that scenario is automatically going to fail in the public's perception.
Right.
Dennis?
I agree with Vice Mayor Kay. If we push too hard, push too much pressure on these neighborhoods, pressure on council people, the pendulum swings. The pendulum swings back too far the other way. I don't believe that's what anybody wants.
Mark, is it easy as you creating an Excel spreadsheet and plugging in a percentage and running that test before it's publicized?
In theory, yeah. I mean, at the most fundamental level, yeah, it's an exercise where we're changing factors. Because again, we're not going to be citing where this infill development literally occurs. We're just going to be saying maybe in 3 different zones of urban core, inside New Circle, outside New Circle, this so many infill units in a catalyst site, so much retail space in a catalyst site, so much commercial space in a catalyst site. That's all we'd be doing. So we can show, we could do one. I mean, obviously we don't want to do a full-on analysis of multiple versions of scenario 3, but if we can definitely, we can definitely do a very kind of basic level of what the percentages or what the units changes are.
Is it possible for you to utilize the recommendation of long-term planning's staffs and for currently until we meet again, and at that time the committee understand that recommendation and
absolutely. I mean, we can talk. I mean, I think Jim Duncan is on the call now, so he's hearing everything everybody's saying. So I think he's going to be informed about what we're talking about. And I think we could, just come to some consensus. It sounds like what I'm hearing is, while we understand why we want to include this redevelopment thing, these redevelopment potential sites or development, we want to stay on the lower side of it. And I think that's a reasonable thing for us to talk with the planning staff and say, okay, what's your, what do you feel most comfortable with, knowing what we've heard from the task force?
It's 3:10 and we've got some more business to discuss. That's the only path forward I see for today's purposes, if that's okay with everybody. Okay.
I think that would give us some good information to go by.
If everybody's okay with it, then we'll move on to Mark's few other slides, and then Craig, I'm gonna ask you to address the schedule a little bit that was referred to earlier.
These I'll bring up my screen again. This kind of gets back to the discussion that you all wanted to have at the end of last meeting, which I believe it's partly had to do with what Mr. Anderson was speaking of, we have a crisis, we have a shortage of land or available housing now, and yet we also have a lot of land that's sitting available for development inside the urban service boundaries. So I was asked just to provide a basic list of what are some of the barriers and what are some of the incentives. Again, this is not like a final definitive list at all. It was just, it's the stuff we've heard. It's the stuff you all have been talking about. And it should be relatively, relatively digestible and easy to understand. So starting with the barriers, why might some of these larger parcels be sitting undeveloped? Well, they may still have development plans. The development plans may have been filed for quite a bit, but they still haven't been developed. Any number of reasons why that could be. It could be as everybody probably knows, there's a spike in construction material costs. There's been labor shortages for the different specialized trades. There are obviously things regarding getting stuff approved and ready for the development that occur, that those could create delays for any number of reasons. Again, obvious one, like if there's no, if the sewer isn't ready for that area yet, or the roads are, it's not in an accessible location for the type of development, maybe they're waiting for those things to occur. Exaction fees, we hear that the market price factor for developing some land, it just doesn't make sense once those exaction fees are incorporated. Maybe that moves on to the next. Maybe in the future they will. Maybe like people are just holding out a little bit longer to see like if in the future they can get a better, a better fit for what the market will bear. And then as Mr. Anderson noted, some of the barriers might just be the competition outside the county for like they're trying to compete with someone that's doing something at a lower cost, whether it's because they're getting some kind of subsidy or whether it's just because the land's cheaper out there and they have to compete with them. So those are just, some of the barriers that might explain it. And then we talk about, what are some of the incentives that could get that land motivated, get them motivated. And it's, again, I'm not advocating for these. I'm just suggesting these are commonly understood incentives for what a developer, and I would defer to the developers to speak for themselves, but there's any number of programs that people do across the country that whether it's of course increasing density that just makes your product more product to sell, allowing different types of zoning and development, changing your zoning and development standards that can encourage a developer to find a project more more possible. A lot of times cities will help move the infrastructure, the linear infrastructure in particular, necessary to make that a site developable because they want that site developed. Of course, tax credits, we know about affordable housing credits, transit credits. When you do, when the city invests in some type of public amenity or a larger plan, that developers can see the commitment from the city for further investments, that can be an incentive. All these things these are the stuff that we came up with, but as of right now, this is really just for your discussion, and I don't know how you guys want to proceed with it, but that's what I prepared.
Thank you, Mark. My thinking on this is we've got to see what incentives are out there that around the United States that we might be able to put in place to help some of these people put their property, get their property developed, because there are some large holdings of property within the urban service boundary that are not moving. So if we can be creative and think of some incentives or get over some obstacles that are in our way, I think we need to really focus on those two things as well.
One thing also, Madam Chair, in terms of incentives that we found was that tax abatement has worked in other communities where they literally can abate property taxes, a certain percentage of them, to encourage developers to develop. So it's another incentive that can be used.
Right. Vice Mayor?
Thank you. I don't mean to be negative, but it seems to me that this discussion is really not within the bailiwick of this task force, that's not what we're supposed to be doing, and there are other entities within government that are supposed to be doing this very thing. So that's my take, is that this task force has a relatively narrow charge, and that we're not here to devise remedies for what we see as lack of development. But that's, again, what it looks like over here.
My thinking on that, Vice Mayor, is that if we have the properties within the urban service boundary and they're not being developed, then the developer is going to push to go outside of the urban service boundaries. So that was my thinking on that.
I agree. And these are questions of policy that have to do with when and where incentives are appropriate. And those are important questions, but I think they're a little bit to the side of what this task force is supposed to be working on.
I believe this task force has to respond to, as Dennis stated, is there going to be a 5-year inventory of land from 2022 to 2027, and if so, the urban service area does not need to be expanded, but can certain parcels of land be taken into account?
So the question is, yes, what are the data, and then what are the triggers? And there may be some policy recommendations, but it seems to me the more important question is, what are we supposed to be looking at? And how are we supposed to use that data to make decisions about what to do or not to do in terms of policy? And then it's other entities, I think, that are supposed to then look at that and say, yes, Planning Commission, for example, they look at that and they say, yeah, we need to be looking at a change in the zoning over, whatever. But that's not our job as a task force, I don't think. And everybody else sees it differently. That's fine with me. I just wanted to kind of weigh in with the way it looks to me. Thank you.
I just think that it's our job to get every bit of property that's within the urban service boundary, whatever we can do, whatever we can take to planning and zoning or whoever, to kind of think out of the box and get some things moving that have not been moved. That was my only thinking, Vice Mayor.
What we've discussed is some if-then statements related to the matrix, taking into certain properties into consideration, if that makes sense.
I can share my screen again to talk about what we talked about the other day about Overbrook or Expansion Area 1 as an example. And this,
Right.
again, this is based on a conversation we had yesterday, and I'm just trying to give myself an out. This is what we were talking about. The big question about what do you do with a significant amount of land that we are incorporating into our evaluation as available for development if in fact it does not develop. Now you're now are relying on this land to develop, but there's no determination that it actually will, right? Oh, okay, hold on, I gotta press the share button. There we go. So we were just talking about how do we handle Overbrook Farm? How do we handle expansion there? That question. Because it is a large chunk. Again, it's 900 acres. And one of the suggestions that we bandied about was the idea that we could just, on a shorter term horizon where we were watching how much land is being consumed to meet the demand. And again, we're talking in this case about housing, residential land. So like, for example, in scenario 2, if we accept that we need to convert or create over 2,000 houses a year. And if you take out the residential units assumed in scenario 2 for Expansion Area 1 or Overbrook Farm, you are left with 34,000 units. So you can see like the acreage, the column of acreage go down and the number of new households or housing units go up. And you can see that rate. And if that rate was just consistent, we would say, well, that provide the 34,000 units that we project in scenario 2 could serve for 16 years. And the 6,000 that are in Overbrook Farm really won't be like, in that sense, officially necessary to meet the requirement for the near term. But they are going to be needed eventually, right? So in theory, you could monitor the development progress on that site and see how it's moving and say, like, are they developing infrastructure plans? Are they coordinating with the city about that key driver of making that site developable? Have they developed any portion of the site? Maybe they've started on a small portion and you can actually see that there is a commitment to develop at least a part of it. That's something that can tell you, well, we expect that it might be more likely than not that the rest gets developed. Eventually, like many parcels that already have plans with the city, they may propose a development plan. All of those things on a more short-term basis could let you know, okay, we see movement, we see expectation that something could happen, and now we can feel more confident that that inventory is available to us. But if you see none, if you see no development progress in 5 years or in 6 years or 7 years, maybe that's the time to start saying, hey, instead of assuming we have 41,000 units total, we more likely have 34,000 units total. And according to the population growth, we're still going to need that full 40,000. And then you make your decisions, your policy decisions accordingly. And I would just say, if you can do it at a small enough increment level so that you're not making a big, a bigger expansion, then you absolutely have to, because no matter what, in this particular case, it is available for development. So you can expand because today you don't see it developing, and then tomorrow they develop. And that's the crux of the problem, right? So it would be trying to just monitor it and accept the premise of when, like your threshold, when your buffer is getting too narrow, that you have to make a decision, and you go ahead and make the decision at the incremental level that you have to get by to meet to reconcile the demand with the supply. And that, again, is just one of the things we were talking about suggesting yesterday.
Thank you, Mark.
Sure.
Shall we continue with an open discussion? If there's no open discussion amongst the committee, shall we move to any public comment? Craig, can you take a look and see if there's any comment among the outside attendees?
Yes, sir. There's one hand raised, Amy Clark. With your permission, I'll bring her into the meeting.
Please do so. Thank you.
Mhm.
Hi, Amy.
Okay, I've unmuted and it looks like I'm visible. I'm Amy Clark and I live at 628 Castle Road in Lexington. That's in the Hollywood area near the Euclid Kroger. I really appreciate the conversation today, and especially some of what Ms. Albright was just saying. What I want to ask, and I think it's a hard question that you're trying to face, is the plan to redevelop commercial land, and in particular retail land, into multifamily or high density or rental or affordable housing? Is it workable? Is it realistic? Can it happen? Is it feasible? This plan to take retail land, like a big old shopping center, and build these apartments. And you've really hit on important things like the cost of construction, the cost of labor. There's a lot more building, more investment in land. And if that land is expensive already, the problem is this: if these are your catalyst sites and your target sites, and you're saying they will carry an important part of the burden of furnishing needed, relatively affordable housing, and then you have other places where land use guidance also says we can expect housing growth here, such as, for example, established neighborhoods, corridors, downtown. If commercial land is not doing its part to meet housing growth, the burden comes disproportionately on single family neighborhoods, on historic areas, on tiny little lots. And I will close with an illustration, and I really do mean it as an illustration, and it isn't a perfect one. But just a week ago, the council deliberated about, I forget if it was 6 or 7 hours, to say, shall we put a density of 55 units per acre on a plot of 2/3 of an acre immediately next door to houses in single family use in a duplex zone neighborhood? So they had a huge, lengthy deliberation and concluded that upzoning to 55 units per acre was appropriate. And then tomorrow, there's a final vote on something that It's really apples to oranges. It's not a great comparison. But Walmart is one of these catalyst sites, the abandoned Walmart site. It bears an R3 that doesn't even allow housing, but it's a highly restricted R3. It doesn't include car lots, bars, I mean, cocktail lounges, various things. Some of the uses that least build employment or housing. And council is in a position to decide, for a curious reason, without planning commission advice. They're in a position to decide, shall we release the restrictions to let this R3, B3 be all that a highway business zone can be, or not? And here's a site where they're saying, well, it's failing as a B3, but it's a site that's in the comp plan as a place where we could have important new housing growth. This could be one of these paradigms for meeting the housing need in a better way by converting retail land. And as I said, it's a very weird situation, but it's a situation, what you're talking about is, are these sites that could bear the burden for multifamily, affordable, dense housing that are on corridors, are they doing their part? And I will just say one last thing, and that's that other sites such as Crossroads Mall and Fayette Mall, they post signs today saying outlots available. An outlot is a one-story, usually a fast food chain, something like that. Also across the street from Fayette Mall, there's a breakfast place that just went in. We have changed our regulations. We have given regulatory incentive to use the B6P, the old shopping center zone, to add housing density. What we're seeing is hotels being added and outlots being added. These were regulatory incentives that could also bring housing density. So I thank you for really thinking hard about what is realistic to forecast from the catalyst sites we've identified and the regulatory incentives that we are beginning to put into place. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amy. As a past member of my neighborhood association, I respect your position very much, as I've been in similar positions. I don't know that we can respond to that because I don't know that the specifics there are within our purview. Craig, would you agree with that statement?
Yes, sir. It really gets to the level of policy that other bodies would be addressing outside of really what we're trying to accomplish as part of this task force. I think I do understand the point. I think good points are made, but when it gets to some of the specific policy questions, it could derail some of what we're trying to do, essentially to go too far into some of those other questions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I hate to.
Are there any other questions out there?
I am not seeing any other hands raised. Thank you.
All right. Okay, everybody, thank you all so much for your time. I think we've done a good job at what we had today. And Craig, do we kind of know the direction that we're heading for the next meeting? We're going to get some information from Planning Commission just to kind of help give us a little guidance on the percentages for the scenarios.
We will. We are going to be providing an update to the Planning Commission members next week.
Okay.
To meet with the planning staff as directed today or as discussed today. Your next regular meeting is May 19th at 1 p.m. During that meeting, you'll be receiving your growth trends evaluation and report. That was one of the tasks that is listed in the scope of work for this. We are moving forward, as you heard today, we're moving forward with public and stakeholder engagement. We're trying to get significantly through some of these answers before we have a community meeting. We're anticipating at this time that would be in June. after your June meeting so that we have some good concrete information to share and bring back to you. And the hope is that we can get through these scenarios and put together some of these criteria for growth expansion for discussion during your July meeting, and essentially come out of that meeting with recommendations that move forward to the Planning Commission. So
That's what we're shooting for.
yeah, and thank you again for your patience today and for listening to what is a pretty in-depth discussion as we work through these issues.
Thank you to everyone.
right,
I
thank
have a quick question. Are we going to get anything written, a written report, a summary document, and when can we expect that?
You will. That growth trends evaluation and report will be distributed in advance of the next meeting.
Okay.
Have an exact timeline for that for you. Mark,
Yeah, the soonest we can get it out, Craig, the best, so we can study it real well.
get that as soon as we can to you, so you have
Okay.
a look at it.
Very good. Very good. Thank you.
Thanks to everyone.
All right, everybody. Thank you all so much for your time. And I think we accomplished some good things today.
Thank you.
So we'll just keep on.
Bye-bye.
Appreciate it. Do I hear a motion to go
Bryce
on to
Bell.
bigger and better things? All right, let's go. Thank you all so much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.